Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to continue discussing, as we have in previous shows, at the beginning of the show, about the U.S. elections and the continuing fallout of the vote count, not vote count, etc., that Donald Trump has put forth, and many complaints about that. But then the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which does observe elections in many Western nations and even former Soviet Union nations, has in fact said that Donald Trump and his rhetoric essentially have hurt and trust in democracy, or undermine trust, in fact, I should say, in democracy, or what their exact words are, saying that, in fact, this vote was competitive and well managed. On top of that, we've also had this group that Facebook has taken down, which was called Stop the Steal, and we've seen some signs of that as well on the streets, I believe, in the U.S. A huge group, and a group that was growing very, very fast. At one point, there were 1,000 new members being added every 10 seconds, and it had grown to about 365,000 members just in a single day. Now, Facebook has taken down that group because this was a group, according to Facebook, that was organized around the de-legitimization, of the election process. And there was even, according to Facebook, worrying calls of violence from some members, which is, again, of course, a concern going forward once and if Joe Biden is confirmed as the president-elect. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. And I'm joined by Shahed Amanullah, who is a former senior advisor at the U.S. Department of State. He's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Also joining us from Washington is Calvin Dark, who is principal and co-founder of RC Communications. And finally, we're also joined from Gaithersburg, Maryland, by Dr. Richard Chasdi, who is a professorial lecturer at George Washington University. Richard, Calvin, and Shahed, good morning to all three of you, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Calvin, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the OSCE, as well as, of course, a whole bunch of other people saying that what Donald Trump has done so far vis-a-vis these elections is, in fact, hurting the entire American democratic process?
I think it's true, and I also don't think it's anything new. Like, one of the things that so much has gone on in the last 4 years. Remember, as soon as President Trump was in office, he established a commission to find out all of the voter fraud that caused him to lose the popular vote in the election with Hillary Clinton in 2016. And the commission was disbanded without finding anything of any substance. And we've also seen during this campaign that has been his message about how if he doesn't win, the election will be rigged. So yes, it is unfortunate just in general. I mean, Trump or no Trump, and when we think about our institutions here in this country, but it also isn't a surprise.
What are your thoughts on that and the long-term or short-term impact of this on the U.S. democratic process, right? Because there are a lot of people who do believe Trump.
Yeah, so we have two different issues here. So the first issue is the integrity of our elections. And I think over the past 200 years, we've proven that the American election system is a pretty secure one. And when there are discrepancies, we're able to deal with them in a fairly civil and legal manner. But then the second part of it, I mean, it doesn't matter how secure your election system is. If you have continual voices going from the grassroots to the top that say that the results are illegitimate, then you're going to have the problem that that Calvin was referring to. That it doesn't matter how legitimate it seems. There's a whole segment of society now, nearly half the voters, that are not going to accept it. And if they don't accept it, then you're not going to be able to have effective rule. And this is a problem that is not just going to be for this election. It's going to be for all subsequent elections. It's going to be for local elections, state elections. And when that undermines for one half of society, the other half is going to feel delegitimized. The other half is going to feel that they're disenfranchised. And now you've got a rift in this country that's going to take really a generation to repair.
And talking about rift, Calvin, we have this Facebook group that's very worrying one, Stop the Steal, which has now been taken down. But again, that reflects the ongoing polarization, right? I mean, what a lot of people had expected in these elections was a huge blue wave that didn't really come to pass. What does this say about going forward for how tough a job this will be for whenever Biden is confirmed as president-elect?
Well, I think, first of all, yes, we are polarized, and that didn't start with Donald Trump. But what is different, that I can't think of another instance in our country where this happened, is that he has encouraged people like in those Facebook groups, when he makes comments on Twitter about remember your Second Amendment, protect your Second Amendment, that's guns. And, there have been these cases with the attempted kidnapping of the governor of Michigan that he laughed off and had people in a crowd were like calling for locking her and other people up. So in that instance, that is new and that's very dangerous. Now, when it comes to bringing our country together, if Joe Biden is able to win and, take office, it'll be a huge task. And it's not something that can be magically done on Inauguration Day. And it's also something that will take the buy-in not only of Joe Biden and the people that voted for him, but also for the millions that voted for Donald Trump, as well as Republicans in the House and the Senate, to all come together on some type of common ground to kind of heal this polarization. But even if that is done right from day one, it's going to take a while.
Shahed, I'll go to you with that then. What do you make of the task ahead for a president like Biden once and if he is confirmed? It doesn't seem like it's easy because even during the Obama years, we did have quite a bit of polarization beginning from then and possibly from even before that, didn't we?
It's easier to start a fire than to put one out. And for all intents and purposes, Trump has lit a fire that is now raging across this country. And Joe Biden by himself is not going to be able to do it, at least not during his term of office. That's going to come down to us, to citizens. And we're going to have to try to create a common ground that lowers the temperature and that starts to get people back from this precipice where violence is a real consideration. Like just as an example, in the past 4 years, I've had many friends who feel like very threatened by the environment that we've created. And, people are not even thinking about this election. They're just thinking about what's going to happen in the next 4 years, 8 years. They're worried about violence in the streets. They're worried about violence, that's perpetrated to them in online spaces or instigated in online spaces. The democratization of hate has become so thorough. And of course, this is overlapped with the rise of Facebook and social media, that it's going to be very, very, very challenging. And it starts with at least believing that your fellow citizens are your fellow citizens. And I'm trying to resist the urge to cut myself off from that group of people and to be tribal, because I know that's just not the way forward.
Richard is back with us. Richard, what are your thoughts about this as Shahed, there's a democratization of hate? I mean, there's so much polarization, so much division in the U.S. right now, isn't there?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of division in the United States now in regards to this election, but this has preceded this election. Trump is really just bringing to the fore what's been stewing in the country now for at least several decades. This is something, if not longer. This is an unresolved conflict. It is the most fundamental about race. It's the most fundamental conflict that we have in the United States, which has remained unresolved since the Civil War and before. So the issue is that what Donald Trump is what's called a political entrepreneur. He derives his power from his base through fear-mongering and through inciting violence. And we need to sort of understand that this is what it is, and we should call it for what it is. We saw yesterday that there were 2 individuals that were arrested in Pennsylvania that were QAnon-affiliated individuals who were armed, headed in the direction at one of the voting centers. This is not surprising, unfortunately, within the context of this. And when this election, and I'm pretty sure when is not rather than if Joe Biden wins this election, the prospect of violence is very high.
And, on the topic of QAnon, Richard, we already have, I believe, some members, some politicians who have won, in fact, seats, I believe, in the Congress or Senate, who are, who sign on to that ideology overall. What does it say that Donald Trump has, in fact, not done badly in these elections, right? I mean, again, as I put to an earlier guest as well, the blue wave didn't really happen.
it's deeply disturbing. The nationwide election poll is around 2% or 3% difference. It's very disturbing, and it's not clear to me whether this would have been substantially different if there was someone similar to Trump articulating these issues, or whether this is more of a cult of personality around Trump, because Trump is supported by U.S. Republican Party leadership at all levels, essentially. It's only now, and this is very sad to see, that you have certain members of Republican leadership beginning to speak out against Trump's excesses in terms of these speeches in regards to conspiracy theories and fraudulent voters, where there is no evidence to speak of to support any of these claims. And I think that's universally acknowledged that this is sort of the last spasms of a presidency in decline. But the fact that there is no basis to any of these allegations, that he seems to be undermining the democratic institutional process so fundamentally that it incites violence in the streets, this is something that I think speaks the measure of the man. This is what the man is all about in terms of pursuit of his own personal interests over and beyond the interests of the country.
All right, and I'll give you the final word before I let all three of you go. What do you think the coming days will hold, right? The coming weeks, months even, really? Because if we are talking about the potential, at least, for violence, and fingers crossed that there won't be any, but if that potential does exist, what kind of an effect will that then have? I mean, can that be subdued and controlled very quickly, do you think, or is there a potential for that to also get out of hand?
Well, I actually think that as far as violence goes, there is a possibility in some parts of the country, I would say more rural parts in the South and across the Midwest, where you may have some of these, militia groups that may, think the election has been stolen. But I think the main obstacle that we're going to have is if it continues as it looks, that Joe Biden will get the 270 electoral votes that he needs. I think our biggest worry or concern is going to be President Trump. I think between what he's going to be telling his people, that's going to decrease their trust in the election. But also this, apart from the election, we have a country to run. We have millions of people out of work who are waiting for a stimulus and economic aid for the pandemic. And in a normal world, regardless of who won the election, the president in the White House between now and January 20th would work with the Congress to get that done. I frankly think that Donald Trump is going to do everything he can to make things look or be as bad as they could, because then that feeds into his message that if you go with someone else other than me, then you are looking at chaos, economic decline, and just bedlam everywhere. So I think that is our major concern between now and January 20th.
Very well with that, but we do sincerely appreciate Calvin, Richard, and Shahed for their time this morning and for sharing their, of course, expert opinions on what's happening there on the ground in the U.S. in the wake of these elections being over and the vote count still continuing as of this recording. At least that may very well change by the time we're on air, and Joe Biden may very well be confirmed by that time. He is very close to that 270 magic number to be able to win enough electoral college votes to then become the president-elect of the United States. What will that then mean? Will we then see immediate outpouring of violence? I mean, that seems like an overstatement, but at the very least, we also have a legal battle ahead, right? There are also all these lawsuits that have been filed by the Trump administration and Trump campaign. And then, of course, as Calvin there correctly said, I mean, there are months of transition to take place here, or at least a month of transition to take place here. And what will Donald Trump do within that month or 2 months before he's meant to hand over the keys to the White House and the country really to Joe Biden, if that is the case? A lot of questions, open-ended questions still to be answered about what's to happen in the coming days, weeks, and months for the United States. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to be discussing Israel as well as Palestine and how Israel, of course, continues to act towards the occupied Palestinian peoples. We are going to talk about the demolition which has occurred in the West Bank, in the occupied West Bank, that is, by Israel. According to the United Nations and a number of experts, this is the largest forced displacement incident in that region in 4 years, some people saying in a decade. Nevertheless, of course, the important factor being that 73 people at the very least have become homeless, amongst them a large number, a significant number of children and women, of course, as well. The Israelis, of course, as always, their argument is that these structures were built illegally, but then even the United Nations has come out and said that Israel doesn't, in fact, issue building permits for Palestinians to build structures, quote unquote, legally, according to what Israel would see as legal, that is. The second thing we're going to discuss today is also the olive harvest season, which is extremely important, of course, for Palestinians. And that, of course, on a yearly basis, successively has become harder and harder for Palestinians to carry out, as much as, of course, the olive harvest is important for both the Palestinian economy as well as culture, etc. Just this year so far, in this olive harvest season, we've had 33 incidents where Palestinians have been attacked by Israeli settlers. Around 1,000 plus olive trees have been burned or have otherwise been damaged, and large amounts of those produce then from those trees have also been stolen. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined firstly by Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, who is a Palestinian politician. He's joining us today from Ramallah. Joining us from Beirut is Laith Marouf, who is an award-winning multimedia producer and broadcasting law consultant. Laith and Dr. Barghouti, thank you both for your time today. Dr. Barghouti, I'd like to start with you. I'd like to start firstly with the issue of the demolition in the occupied West Bank. What are your thoughts about that?
What we see today is that Israel is trying to abuse any remaining time for Trump being in the White House, and they have exercised massacre, actually, of homes and demolishing and transforming many families, tens of people, making them homeless. What we see is an act of ethnic cleansing in the Jordan Valley, which Israel plans to annex. The idea here is that Israel prevents Palestinians from building in 62, the West Bank, which is occupied by, according to international law, and at the same time, whenever they build anything, they come and demolish it. And that's exactly what they have done. I have to remind you that 10,000 houses are also threatened to be demolished in the city of Jerusalem alone. So practically, we are talking about ethnic cleansing that is trying to repeat the same ethnic cleansing that was conducted in 1948 against Palestinians, only at a slower rate. And that is a very serious violation of international law. Many of the structures that were demolished were built by the European Union. So practically, Israel also demolished not only the houses, but the contributions of taxpayers in Europe.
Laith, what are your thoughts? Because that's an important point that Dr. Barghouti there just made, right? It's not as if these are just structures that were built completely by Palestinians, right? Because, of course, they're not giving building permits anyhow, but these are also structures built by the likes of the United Nations and the European Union, both of which have also criticized this demolition.
It's clear that the United Nations and the European Union, all they can do is platitudes and condemnations. And this is what has been happening for decades. The EU condemns things crimes that apartheid Israel commits, and then does nothing. And in fact, the funding that the EU provides to Palestinians may be considered as a subsidy for the occupation. We have to contextualize what is happening in Palestine as part of a larger colonial history, imperialist history of European and Americans in the region. And it also copies exactly what the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians did to the indigenous people in those lands. Forcing the indigenous people to live on reservations, those now designated areas in the West Bank, that the Palestinians can rule themselves, and then taking away the rest of the land and forcing on it settler colonialists to change the demographic and the facts on the ground. So the European Union can condemn as much as it wants, but in reality, it actually supports the apartheid configuration in Palestine, and it continues to give justification to the colonization of the land.
Barghouti, I also want to talk about the olive harvest season. Of course, for those of us who are not Palestinian, I imagine we cannot fully appreciate how important olive harvest season is for Palestinians, as I said, both economically and as a widespread culture as well. What are your thoughts about that on a yearly basis, this becomes harder and harder for Palestinian farmers to even be able to access their own farmland and their own olive trees?
We have to go back to the so-called Trump's plan, or what I call the ploy of the century. And that plan was written by Netanyahu and by the Israeli extreme Zionist movement. It includes the annexation of big parts of the West Bank, which is occupied. That includes Jordan Valley, includes settlement areas, etc. What Israel does is an actual implementation of that plan, which they continue to proceed with, regardless of whether Trump is elected or not. And their plan actually is a plan of ethnically cleansing the area, settling Israeli legal settlers, and Judaizing the West Bank, repeating what Israel did to Palestinian communities in 1948 areas, in the Nazareth, in the Galilee, in the Negev, etc., etc. In my opinion, this will continue, and it will not stop unless two things happen. First, a stronger popular Palestinian nonviolent resistance, or a popular resistance that can really stand up to the Israeli measures. But this cannot be successful alone without a strong boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign from outside. And here the European Union, the UN, and many other countries have to do what was done to the apartheid system in South Africa. So far, as your guest said, all we hear is statements of sometimes of condemnation, but most of the time it's just statements of protest that Israel doesn't care about. The European Union has the largest ability to exercise sanctions, at least against settlements, if they don't want to exercise sanctions against the whole Israeli system. But they don't do that. And Israel is the largest, has the European Union as its largest trade partner. It is the largest research contributor to the Israeli research system. If European really means respecting international law, they have to start exercising boycott and divestment and sanctions on Israel.
Marouf, one of the interesting things is that within that Middle East peace plan, as Dr. Barghouti spoke about, it was spoken of that the Palestinians would need to have further investment, that their economic prospects would need to improve, right? That's something that Jared Kushner has spoken about over and over and over again over this time that, that he's been within the White House as the advisor to Donald Trump. But it seems sort of then counterintuitive to also then allow for the olive harvest season not to go through, because that is a vital part of the Palestinian economy as well. I mean, those two things don't really work parallel, side by side, do they?
No, they don't, and it's intentional. You see what is happening with the destruction of the olive orchards of Palestine. Over 1 million in the past 10 years, olive trees cut or burned by the colonizers, is a copy of what Canada and the United States did to the indigenous people. So we know right now, for instance, and it's still happening, in Canada, the indigenous Mi'kmaq nation have been attacked by the settlers every time they try to fish. So what is the intention here? Is to make it impossible economically for a nation to continue existing without the permission of the settler colonists. And we have to also remember right now that the collaborating regimes in the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain are actually going to be investing in apartheid Israel. We see right now the Emirati leadership saying that they are going to buy Israeli wine produced in the occupied territories of the Golan Heights. This is a product that is boycotted in the West by many people, and now the Emirates is going to give it a market. So who is investing in Palestine? Nobody. The investment that is happening right now is in maintaining apartheid Israel. And I want to note something, that the BDS campaign is very important, only as far as it is a propaganda fight to educate the Western populace. There will be no actual sanctions coming from the West, not even unions, for instance, in Canada that I worked in to pass the BDS, who passed the BDS almost 15 years ago, have pulled out their investments. So it's what's important is Palestinian resistance on the ground, and that it's effective and not giving in to the supposed peace.
All right, Dr. Barghouti, I'll give you the floor before I let both of you go. On this point of the economy, that's something I'm going to go back to Jared Kushner and his statements about how, Palestine needs more investments. Essentially, I mean, if I'm going to paraphrase the policy, it seems that they just wanted to throw money at the Palestinians and that would convince them about the Middle East peace plan. Is that the solution? I mean, of course, no one's going to argue that Palestinians would love investment, and that certainly would be a welcome change. But do you think that that's the issue? I mean, if the economy is good, does that make everything fine for the Palestinians?
There will be no good economy and no serious economy without freedom. How could we have an improved economy if we are unable to control our market, our export, our import, and even our tax revenue? Israel controls 70% of the tax revenue, which represents 90% of the Palestinian government budget. So without freedom, we cannot have any economic development. What Kushner proposed in the Trump's plan is a big deceit. It's a big ploy. I analyzed this plan completely and in details. And what I discovered when it came to the issue of economy is that what they are speaking about is substituting the existing support to Palestinians that come either through UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Refugees, and the aid that comes to Palestinian Authority. They want to substitute it with an aid that is less than by 50% from what we get now, and 50% of that 50% is loans. So practically, Mr. Kushner wants to substitute what we get now from international community and from Arab countries with 25% of support. Practically, this is a big deceit. People think there will be a serious development, but actually it's one way of drying up the Palestinian economy and one way of destroying any potential for investment in Palestinian territories. It's a big deceit. It's not true. It's not correct. And most of all, it is important to understand there can be no economic development without freedom, no economic development without Palestinians controlling their natural resources. At this moment, Israel controls 90% of our water resources, all our natural resources, the whole land, the whole borders. How can we have economic development with that?
Indeed. Well, we'll that with Dr. Barghouti and Laith, but we appreciate both of them for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their expertise and thoughts with us on both the olive harvest as well as the demolition of those many structures, Palestinian structures in the occupied West Bank. We'll continue discussing this right after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to continue discussing, as we did in the first segment, about the olive harvest season as well as the demolition that has occurred in the West Bank, leaving at least 73 Palestinians, including women and children, homeless. We're going to discuss that further now with two other guests who are joining us now to discuss this. We're joined now by Yousef Helou, who is a political analyst and journalist who is joining us from London. And we're joined from Jerusalem by Jeff Halper, who is the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Jeff, Yousef and Yousef, thank you both for your time today. Yousef, let me start with you, and let's firstly discuss the demolition that's occurred in the occupied West Bank. 73 Palestinians now homeless. Of course, it's not like this is a new thing. This has been occurring for so many years now, but this has been seen as one of the largest such demolitions for at least 4 years, I believe. And the United Nations, the EU, have also condemned it. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think Israel is racing against time to destroy as much as Palestinian properties in case Donald Trump loses the elections. We know that Trump is Israel's closest friend, and he gifted Netanyahu many gifts. So I think it's a continuation to Israel's ongoing policy of ethnic cleansing to get rid of the indigenous population of the land, especially across the West Bank, in particular in the Jordan Valley. And we know that Israel never stopped its expansion of settlements, and that region, the Jordan Valley, is classified a security closed zone. So that's why Israel is targeting those vulnerable Bedouin communities who don't live in a specific location. They are on the move all the time. So these people have become homeless and displaced because of this cruel policy. And you can imagine it's wintertime, and such actions are carried out amid COVID-19 pandemic. So I think the United Nations also raised the alarm, urging Israel to stop such violations, urging the international community to intervene. And what's happening is not acceptable, of course, and it happens while the world is busy following the American elections.
Yeah. Joe, what are your thoughts about that? Because, you know, we, of course, have had condemnations coming out from the EU and the United Nations. And the United Nations obviously aptly has put, as we all know, that it's not like the Israeli argument about these being illegal structures even holds water, because Israel doesn't even really give out very often those building permits to Palestinians to be able to build any structures altogether. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I agree with Yousef. I think Israel's exploiting this American election and the few months that Trump has left in order to clear the table of this issue. But there's another aspect of this as well, and that is, of course, the whole normalization process going on with other Arab and Muslim countries. And the excuse being given by the Emirates, for example, and the other countries to normalize with Israel is constructive engagement. That if we normalize with Israel and engage with Israel, then we can help the Palestinians, and we can end the occupation, and we can help bring peace about. I think Israel's message here is very clear. There is no connection between the process of normalization and our continuing annexation of the West Bank, our continuing cleansing of the Palestinian population, so that if, in fact, this policy of demolition, I mean, it's in your face. It isn't like quiet. This is the largest demolition in years, but it's been going on all the time. If this can happen in your face, and then it doesn't at all impact negatively on this so-called normalization process, then Israel, in a sense, has created another political fact on the ground. That is that we can normalize, that the international community will agree to normalization without any reference whatsoever to the Palestinian issue or what Israel's doing on the ground.
So I also wanted to talk about, the olive harvest season. And again, for a lot of us who are not Palestinians, I don't think we fully appreciate how important olive harvest is overall for Palestinians. I mean, both economically, and I believe there's an entire culture really around this sort of harvest season. And on a yearly basis, it becomes harder and harder for farmers to be able to even access their own land, to be able to get to those trees, et cetera. And on a yearly basis, we also know that, as in this year as well, I believe 1,000 plus olive trees have already been burnt or damaged and produce stolen. What can you tell us about that?
Well, a big percentage or bulk of the Palestinian community, especially those who live in the West Bank, they rely on the agriculture sector. And olive trees and citrus trees, it's all a profession for those farmers. But unfortunately, year after year, the green areas are, become deserted because of the Israeli policy of bulldozing those land, make them off limits to Palestinians, and also let's not forget the cruel actions of Israeli settlers who target farms and especially all of the groves and trees. I don't know. I mean, Palestinians, they appreciate the olive tree as a blessed holy tree. I'm not sure if the other side, they don't like this approach. But overall, Israel has a policy to weaken the Palestinian economy. It wants the Palestinian population to rely on the Israeli economy. And it's all to do with grabbing more land, forcing the population of the land, especially the indigenous population who resisted the ethnic cleansing that persisted ever since 1994 to leave. It's outrageous that the international community, the EU, which is the largest economic partner with Israel, the U.S. administrations, of course, Palestinians they didn't put their hope on the U.S. administration because it has never been an honest peace broker. But as Jeff mentioned, the normalization diplomatic ties that were reestablished recently between some Arab Gulf countries, it actually gave Israel a green light to go on and attack the Palestinians.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that, to me at least, isn't making sense is that, you know, we've heard, and I know we've spoken about this before too in previous shows with you, about how Jared Kushner has always said, you know, it's essentially about throwing money at the Palestinians, right? That in the Middle East peace plan, at least the economic part, is that, you know, if we invest more in Palestinians, if they become financially secure and stronger, that will make the Middle East peace plan okay in some ways. But then at the same time, we now have, we've had for so long the olive harvest season as just one example, of course, of the attack on the Palestinian economy. How do those two things work side by side, if at all?
Well, they don't work side by side. And this is all part of Trump's what's called transactional diplomacy, making deals. You know, in other words, the whole conception is that you have some immediate self-serving interests. You have a Palestinian elite. They need money. The business people need money. And let's make a deal. We can buy you off. You know, what's your price? In other words, the assumption is everybody has a price. And this kind of approach, of course, ignores the people. It ignores the wider political situation. It obviously ignores human rights, international law, justice, anything political. There's nothing political to it. It's just it's a deal like you would make in a business world. And I think our challenge as activists, Palestinians with their Israeli and international allies, is how do we deal with this? How do we take the offensive? What do you do when you have an international system in which international law, its own rules, human rights, justice, political process is money and deals and the elites dealing with each other? How do we deal with that? And I think this is the real question that we Palestinians and Israelis have to sit down together and really begin to deal with.
So then, Yousef, talk about the elephant in the room, and that is, of course, the U.S. elections, as we've spoken about. Will there be any effect if Biden were to win, as it seems likely now?
I think Palestinians look at Biden as a better option, to be honest, because obviously Trump sabotaged the international system, and he gave a very, 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 very bad image about America. And of course, violating the international treaties, the climate change, and the status of Jerusalem. I think it will change a lot because I think Biden will bring America back to its correct image. But overall, Israel considers itself a country above the international law. It enjoys a culture of impunity, and Israel and the United States under Trump's administration, they use the carrot and stick policy to squeeze Palestinians to the corner, to extort them, to blackmail them in order to dictate their orders on the Palestinians.
We'll leave that as a final word, as clock has gotten the best of us. We appreciate, of course, both Yousef and Jeff for their time and expert insight on this. Yousef, they're speaking to us from London, and Jeff speaking to us from Jerusalem. We've spoken about both olive harvest season and, just the economic symbolism there, and of course the cultural symbolism. As Yousef there said, Palestinians have great respect for their farms as well as for nature and those olive trees, as they have, of course, for many, many, many years and generations. And of course, then there is the issue of the demolitions, which have always continued, really, but we've just had a fairly large one that hadn't taken place at this scale in one day in about 4 years or 10 years, depending on which estimates you believe. What does this mean for any peace process going forward? Is there even a peace process happening right now? Because we have normalization where the countries that have normalized ties with Israel have insisted that they've done so with the Palestinians' best interests in mind, as I've said many times in this show. Nevertheless, that isn't really being proven on the ground. The Israelis continue with the demolitions. They continue with annexation of the occupied West Bank. And there doesn't seem to be any progress vis-a-vis suspension of these sorts of demolitions or annexations. So what's really happening here? Why didn't they just say from day one they were doing it for their own national interests and economic interests, and that the Palestinians can deal with their situation on their own, as we all pretty much know is what the situation right now is on the ground? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.